This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week we discuss Mike Flanagan's 2019 film, Dr. Sleep. All right, so back to this sacred project, back to The Shining, back to Dr. Sleep, back to The Overlook. This is going to be the end of the coverage here. This is the last one, so it's a little bittersweet. Kind of feels similar to when we covered It Chapter 2.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, what was the hashtag? Dare to go back, or I can't remember, something like that online.
So I think that was it. Yeah.
Yeah, we dared and we did it.
I dared.
Yeah, I mean, by box office numbers, not many people apparently dared, but we can get into that.
Yeah, it's having some interesting response because I feel like what I'm seeing is tons of people just loving this movie, and then at the same time I see the box office, and it's like worrying. It's like, what does that mean for movies right now? And like, I guess it's also, I've been thinking a lot about like who this movie was for, and like who it could have been marketed to, and like maybe that has something to play with it, like, you know. And then I started thinking about the title. I heard somebody on talking about the title and how it seemed like a hard sell a little bit.
I mean, just to get into it a little, I guess, I was sort of perplexed by this movie after I got out of it. And it took me a day or two to process it and figure out what is going on with it that I was reacting to. And I think I have arrived, though. And that's one of the things that makes me excited to record this episode, is I think I figured it out. Like, I think I've got this movie's number now. But at first I did not. So I'm excited to sort of get into that. But I also am curious to see, because I feel like one of the good things about our podcast is that our tastes align enough to where we have like a really common ground in which we can talk about things, but differ enough to where it gives us enough room to have a discussion, right? But in general, I normally feel like I have a good sense for how you're going to feel about a movie, or a book even. And occasionally I'm wrong a little bit, but usually I feel like it's pretty close. But I was definitely a little, had a little bit of trepidation come into this. I'm really curious to see how you feel about this movie and how that lines up with how I feel, because it could be like we're right on with each other's, or it could be completely different. So I'm kind of fascinated to see where we're at.
I think you posing that kind of opened the door to show me kind of how you felt about it.
Yeah. Well, don't let that affect you. I really want to know just your pure reaction. Yeah.
Yeah. The overall word that I kept using was mixed, very, very mixed.
Okay.
And interestingly, I kept saying I kept using this phrase, and I don't know if this really encompasses exactly what I'm trying to say, but I felt like this movie was a really interesting experiment. I think there was the battle between it being its own story, it trying to find its own footing from Stephen King, and it trying to also please fans of Kubrick's Shining film. I felt that some of the movie was pretty indulgent, and I was surprised to feel that way, because there were certain things that I felt like I wanted, and we talked about in our coverage from the book, and I was surprised that there was less of it. And I was surprised at certain things that they did and certain ways characters ended up in the story of Dr. Sleep. And it was interesting to see some of the things that I wondered about changed in this movie, and interesting to see my reaction to it. So I would say overall mixed. I sounds like I said a lot of things that I didn't like so far. So I would say that, like, as it stands on its own, like, I think it's a great adaptation of Dr. Sleep. I think it is a weird sequel to The Shining, kind of. But I overall enjoyed it. I think I left the movie having, like, happy that I saw it, happy that it exists, but also not feeling like it. I mean, and this was to be expected, but not feeling like it really held a candle to the original Shining. And but I don't know. I think there was some, like, winks and nods, and I think the main thing that I walked away with is, like, if you were gonna make a fan film of The Shining and do it in way of adapting Dr. Sleep, I think that Flanagan had like a big shoes to fill and was able to execute both the book and a sequel to Kubrick's film while also making a serviceable movie that I enjoyed, but was kind of not fully taken with.
Okay. I would say that is pretty close to what I thought you might, where you were going to be, and I'm glad to see that I at least know you well enough to know that you would have some misgivings about this movie, right? Like it wasn't just like, oh, I absolutely loved it. So before I want to get into like sort of my general stuff, I just want to set up the podcast a little bit in case someone's checking this out. We covered the book over 2 episodes prior to this. So if you want to hear us get into like the nitty gritties of Dr. Sleep as a piece of work, especially the book version, that's probably going to be the best place for that. We're going to talk about non-spoilers thoughts here at the top as much as possible in very general terms. Then we'll get into some stuff about Mike Flanagan, the director, and then we'll move into spoiler thoughts for the plot, just so you can kind of know what to expect. We'll definitely put that in the show notes, and we'll make clear when we're going to start talking heavy spoilers. All right, so all that being said, like I said, I was perplexed by this movie because I came out of it after having read all this stuff on Twitter that was really, for the most part, overwhelmingly positive. It was a lot of people saying it was it was a loving homage. It was a great sequel. It was a beautiful movie. It was a perfect Stephen King adaptation. I mean, a lot of people were very superlative in their love of this movie. However, I was also reading that it was underperforming. Now, I don't know if that's really true, but it looks like it was at least half of like what they were expecting. Like it was coming in pretty low. It wasn't a massive budget to begin with, so it seems like it's not like a huge flop in that sense, but it wasn't reaching expectations. And so it seemed like these two things were really at odds with each other. And I saw other people kind of reacting to that and going like, why is this happening? Because this movie is good, right? And so then that kind of got me thinking like, what's going on here? And I think you hit the nail on the head too, that it is a weird sequel to The Shining. And God, I have so many thoughts trying to put them in order and in a way to present them, make sense, and not touch on spoilers. Okay, so my biggest comparison point was 2 of my most beloved sequels are Aliens to Alien, and one of the ones we covered recently, Blade Runner 2049 to the original Blade Runner. And when I thought about those 2 movies, they're kind of different in the way they approached being a sequel. Blade Runner, the original sci-fi, 1982 version, is sort of an art house sci-fi film, right? And Denis Villeneuve came in and made an art house sci-fi film to be the sequel. And he came in with his vision, and he was sort of uncompromising, and he was in the world of Blade Runner 2040 or Blade Runner, and he was playing with a lot of the same themes, but it was its own movie, strongly so. And it felt like an appropriate sequel to me because it kept that art house spirit alive. Now, this movie doesn't, to me, that's the main thing that it doesn't do. To me, The Shining is an art house horror film. And this movie is a horror film, but it is not art house. And I think that is the main thing that hit me and didn't feel right. And so then I thought about Aliens, because I said, well, Aliens kind of did this too, right? Like the original Alien is a much more like tense, close, slow-paced, psychological horror set in space. And then James Cameron came in and made more of an action horror, right? In Aliens, and I feel like that movie works. And so I thought, like, okay, you can fundamentally change what kind of story you're telling here, yet still feel like a really good sequel. So why does that movie work and not give me qualms, whereas this movie did? And I think it has to do with camp and fan service and reference and how much you use those things. Because the one thing Aliens didn't do, in my opinion, is it didn't try and recreate scenes from the original too much. It didn't try and reference over and over and over again the original movie. It sort of stood on its own as its own thing, even though it was a different genre and it was based off the same stuff. Now I'm talking about, I mean, we're getting into all kinds of movies and stuff, so I know this is huge, but this movie, on the other hand, I think relies too heavily on references, visual references, even just like blatant, like this is the same as what you saw, right? And then fan service is the only way I can think of it. There was a lot of Shining fan service, like just sort of showing you things and going like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Remember that from The Shining? And there was a lot of that it just felt like diametrically opposite from an art house experiment that Kubrick was essentially doing with the original adaptation. So that's a lot to say, and it's something I'll try and unpack throughout the rest of this episode. But what's your initial thoughts about that reading of this movie?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say to that is I listened to a couple interviews with like Mike Flanagan and some of the producers, and I think that they realized they very much couldn't approach the movie as they shouldn't try to emulate Kubrick and make like a Kubrick film, because they would just fail like from the start. I think that like that was wise. And so what I think we're seeing is a filmmaker who, like you said, is maybe accustomed to making a certain type of horror film, coming in and putting his own spin on it and like putting his mark on a film, while also trying to like pay homage and like reference and do all these things with the Kubrick stuff. And I think very specifically like adapt Dr. Sleep almost exactly how it is on the page. There are some slight differences here and there. And really, I think the film was able to show me like there's, in terms of like the book and the movie being so different, there's obviously like character differences and build up differences, but just like the ending being different wasn't that big of an issue, I feel like, with what they wanted to do in this film. I think the comparisons are definitely there to be made by like a different voice coming in and directing a film, like in the example of like Blade Runner and Alien. But with this, it's almost like trying to not only change the voice of one project, but two projects. So I don't know. I think I will like give them credit for the fact that like they didn't try to make a Kubrick film. They didn't try to go art house with it. They played to their own style. Like Mike Flanagan played to his own style. And like made it his own film. And I think for most of it, for majority of it, it is just a Mike Flanagan Dr. Sleep film that doesn't feel like it's really that connected to The Shining until it is, until they go in and try to make it specifically with a couple of things like a Shining sequel.
Right. I mean, you're not wrong. And I know a lot of stuff I've said is very critical. And I think, you said it best when you said mixed was sort of my reaction to this movie, and it was. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of things to like there. I do think it was a good adaptation of the book. I don't know that it completely nailed everything, which I can get into more specifics when we get into spoilers as to why. But I think a lot of the Dr. Sleep direct adaptation stuff was some of the best stuff. I think we had some really excellent performances, especially Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. I thought was easily the best performance, I think, in this movie for me. It was
she was awesome.
Extremely good. Very captivating. Did a lot of work kind of being the villain in this movie, right? Like, had to carry a lot of weight there. A lot of the stuff between her and Abra is some of the strongest stuff in this movie, in my opinion. And then I think the real nexus of whether or not you're going to love this movie or be like me and feel very mixed about it is how you feel about the third act of the film, which we'll have to save a little bit for spoilers, I think, because that's where a lot of changes were made. That's where the heaviest homage happens. And that's where, in my opinion, it feels like the movie's trying to do a lot. And whether or not you feel like personally it works for you, or if it doesn't work for you, is where it's gonna affect how you feel about this movie. But yeah, let me come back around a little bit to my art house stuff. Before we get into spoilers, just because I want to dig into that just a little bit more. And I found this definition of art house because I felt like I wasn't like super comfortable defining what I mean by that, but I think it's useful to talk about. So I found this website called wonderfulcinema.com, and they gave this definition of art house. Art house is a film genre which encompasses films where the content and style, often artistic or experimental, adhere with as little compromise as possible to the filmmaker's personal artistic vision. And I think that's a pretty good definition. It goes on to sort of explore that, right, and talk about examples and talk about what that means. But I think that's a good place to look at. It's a very auteur-driven visionary director comes in, has a very specific story they want to tell, and then they're sort of uncompromising in the way they do it. And The Shining has always been an interesting case study because it is in some ways a blend, because it's that, but it's also a horror movie, and it is, which is, you know, sometimes considered more of a like a populist genre, whether or not that's fair. And then it is also an adaptation of a book, so it's struggling sort of with all three of these things to come together. And I think if you love The Shining because it is a horror movie that scared you, and you love The Shining because the creepy hotel, then this movie is going to play really well for you. If at your core you like The Shining or love The Shining because of its art house nature, because of the layered meanings, because of repeat viewings, because of the question of is there or isn't there something supernatural going on, and you love like all of that stuff going on in the movie, then I think this movie isn't going to land with you as well. And what's interesting is I believe their advertising campaign showed what kind of movie this is. And it showed that this is a movie that's going to have the creepy twins in it. This is a movie where we're going to reference, we're going to show you all your favorite scenes from The Shining. We're going to tell the story, right? And I think it signaled to people who like the art house nature of The Shining that this wasn't a movie they were going to be interested in seeing. So I think a lot of people who fall into that camp did not come out to see this movie. And I think that's one of the reasons why the box office numbers were not as high.
Yeah. I found myself, and this is to like kind of, you know, when we covered this project, which the project that I'm referencing is Ready Player One, there was a scene very specifically that both you and I enjoyed and we thought was really fun and interesting and cool. And I made the comparison after having seen this that it felt almost like something you would have seen in Ready Player One. Like some of the stuff that went on in this film felt a lot like, it's like not like somebody, like you talked about art house, it's not like somebody experimenting, it's not like somebody being you know, using their vision to do something weird and different. I know I say weird and different a lot on this podcast, but I feel like that's kind of like what, like uniqueness and something like that, something like a film by a filmmaker like Kubrick is very specific in what it's trying to do, right? So he knows
the artistic vision, right? It's uncompromising. Right.
So from the get-go, like, you know that his, like as you said, uncompromising in every way, but you know that it's going to be something unlike anything you've seen before. Whereas I feel like if you come into this film, like you've been saying, it is similar to other films that you've seen before. And I think some of the novelty of The Shining being a Kubrick film is that, like, you can't define it. It's undefinable. It's not really a horror movie. There are people who watch that movie and they're like, it wasn't scary at all. There are people who think it's the scariest thing they've ever seen, and I think that it's the mark of like an interesting film and something that takes risks and swings really, really hard to give you something that you've never seen before. And that's not to say that this movie can't also exist. I just think that this movie was trying to accomplish something different. I think if you're a fan of The Shining, as you said, I think you would enjoy this. If you are someone who is like steeped in Kubrick films, I like you said, I mean, you may not be as excited about something like this. I also think that there's a way to be both, right? Like you can be a huge Kubrick fan and then take this movie with a grain of salt and enjoy it for the fact that it's fans looking up to their idols and standing on the shoulders of giants and really like turning in something interesting to talk about. And I think that this movie is another great excuse to go rewatch The Shining.
Yeah, and I do agree with everything you're saying. My only pushback to that is, once again, that we have seen something like Blade Runner 2049 come out, and now there were a lot of people who didn't jive with that movie, right? And it wasn't what they wanted from a Blade Runner sequel. And I wonder if maybe they were wanting something more like what this movie does, right? That more directly references the original. You have scenes being recreated. Sort of the way The Force Awakens does this to the original trilogy, and especially Episode 4 of Star Wars, right? Like, there's a lot of direct callbacks in the construction of the film and scenes and all this stuff, right?
And I think, but I also think it's very clear that we're living in a society that thrives on that right now, right? Like, so it's like audiences are very into that. Okay,
but then you look at something like, this is probably a bad example because I haven't seen it. But The Joker is gangbusters right now. the new Joker film, has made tons of money. I haven't seen it, but I want to, because I can tell that it's an art house movie. Like, I can tell that from the trailers. It is uncompromising in many ways, and it just feels like if you take that movie and then you instead change it into a sequel to, say, The Dark Knight, and you make it to where a movie was, instead of making the movie that you got, it's instead all about referencing The Dark Knight and recreating scenes from The Dark Knight and paying homage to The Dark Knight. But it's not that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you bring up Joker, though, because interestingly enough, there's more parallels to something like this than I think is apparent, because I think very clearly Joker is an homage and it's a Martin Scorsese film. It's Taxi Driver nearly. So it's like the idea of like getting something repetitive that you've seen before, but slapping a nice label on it that people would go see in theaters. It's almost like an art house film that has like a name behind it that would draw an audience. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's somebody using this idea of like making a movie very similar to their heroes. So like this director making a movie very similar to a Scorsese film, and then putting a name like Joker on it and making it like basically adjacent to a superhero world. You're playing with art house and what appeals to audiences right now, and the references and all that kind of stuff.
So in some ways, maybe a bad example, but like I said, I haven't seen it, so I'm going to struggle to maybe use specific ways to link those two. But I don't know. I just keep thinking about like how maybe it is asking a lot to expect someone to be able to come along and do another auteur vision of an adaptation that is itself a sequel. Like, that is a lot to ask, but I don't think it's beyond the pale for moviegoers to want something like that for a Shining sequel. Like, I think people might genuinely want another just like life-changing experience with a movie. And if they go in thinking like, if you're going to do a sequel to The Shining, it better be that, and then they see this, they're going to be disappointed.
Look, I wish that we had that movie instead, right? Like that's the movie I would have liked to have seen as well.
And I think a lot of people feel that way, and I think a lot of those people didn't go see this movie.
It's like trying to recreate Kubrick. I feel like would have been really tough. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Like if you were gonna make something that's like in the same vein as something like a Blade Runner 2049, where you like are basically, like you said, and like, I don't know, some people may say that like Blade Runner 2049 suffered at the box office because it wasn't marketable enough.
Right.
And like, you know, so it's like there's a fine line somewhere in there where it's like it could be art house but also profitable and all of these things. But ultimately, like, I would have rather seen something more art house and something more in line with what we'd already gotten before, with like something experimental, something new, something different. And yeah, so like I mentioned earlier that I felt that this was an interesting experiment, and I kept saying experiment because it felt fan made. It felt in some ways like, I guess when it starts to get very Shining heavy, it felt like as a director, Flanagan was saying like, how much fun would it be to revisit these places we've been to before? The sets were recreated, like these, they like redid it all, and in terms of shots used in the movie, I think there's only a couple that were used from Kubrick's footage. So it's like, not only did they, so it's like, it's nearly like just recreating it in a way. And I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing to do. And I think, you know, we'll talk about more with like the recasting of the actors in certain roles and like a lot of these decisions that were made. I think that it was an experiment. I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. And I think audiences maybe aren't responding to it as well as people would have liked. But I think at the same time...
And the caveat of that is that people are liking this movie who saw it.
Right.
It's interesting because it's a lot of self-selection, I think. I think a lot of people who knew they weren't going to like this movie didn't go see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's the case here. And I don't know if it's that... I don't know, because I wouldn't expect it to completely bomb though. If it was like audiences were, because it's not like the super fans are that large of a group of people. You would think. I would think like a more general audience would be interested in it. But like I said, maybe it is the fact that like other people, like certain people in a more general audience, haven't seen The Shining or aren't as clicked in with The Shining, and that makes them not interested in going to see it.
I think that is part of it too. Is the fact that you're making a sequel to a movie that was made in 1980 and it's almost 2020 now. Right. So it's almost 40 years old. And that was something I think that Blade Runner also hit, right? Like, a lot of younger people just haven't seen The Shining. Sad as it sounds, you know, like, it's just true. And a lot of people hadn't seen Blade Runner. So if you haven't even seen the thing that it's referencing, you're probably going to immediately go, well, this isn't for me.
With all of this comparison, I would like to say that I think it's interesting to compare the two, and we're going to continue to compare The Shining and Doctor Sleep, like Kubrick's The Shining. But I also think it would be interesting to put this movie, and maybe the first 2/3 of this movie, up against other modern horror films. Because I think that in terms of landmark horror, like, you can't get much further than The Shining. So you're already having to compare it to the best of the best. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to hear, like, in terms of just like what is currently available, like how you felt about the movie in general. I think after that we should move into some of the filmmaker and actors and things like that.
I mean, for one, like, I do like horror and watch horror movies. However, I am behind, I think, is a safe way to say, on a lot of modern horror. I've seen ones here and there, but I don't feel like I'm like super steeped in the modern horror landscape enough to really comment on that. All I can say is that as an adaptation of Dr. Sleep, it hit almost all the notes I wanted. And we talked in our book coverage about how Dr. Sleep, the book, is much more of a dark fantasy, in our opinion, than a true horror story like the original Shining book was in many ways. And this movie, I think, leans into that. It gets very over the top, right? Like, we have some, for lack of a better word, magical scenes that go on here. In a sense, a lot of that worked for me because I was ready for it from having read the book. I don't know. I guess a lot of that stuff was good. I mean, like I said, I already mentioned I like some of the performances, so I think that carries a lot of it. And I think Ewan McGregor as Danny Torrance was good. I think some of the stuff he does in the third act is some of the stuff he struggled with most. But I think a lot of the majority of the beginning of this movie and in the middle was all really, really good for him. I mean, I'm struggling to talk about it in ways until we really get into spoilers, so we might have to move into that to really get into this. But what's your thinking on it? Since it seems like you might have some opinions about that.
I just think of, like, as you're talking about, I think there's like this huge surge of more art house horror that's been coming out recently. And I think that it is, like, inspired. It's like the kind of art house horror that's, like, clearly inspired by sort of the tone and maybe sort of the slow burn nature of a Kubrick film or something like that. Very clearly, I would say that any modern horror film director has seen The Shining and is being influenced by it. And so I just thinking in terms of, like, this film, I think what they did here was make Dr. Sleep the focus of trying to be a massive blockbuster instead of being maybe maybe approaching it with a smaller budget and approaching it with, like,
the Lighthouse or something like that, right? Like
I think it's just like the reason I think people are freaking out about it underperforming, and the reason I think a lot of people are and that's the other thing, is I think a lot of people are very passionate in terms of liking it and not liking it, I think really comes down to the fact that it's expectations. Like, they just built expectations that would have been hard to meet. And I think you have a great cast. I think you have great performances. There's a lot of good in this movie, but it's so tough because you're comparing it to The Shining and you're expecting a huge turnout. And I think while critical praise isn't what they thought it would be, it's still fair. Like, it's still, I think critics are still saying that it was like it was a good representation of a Stephen King novel. Yeah. And then ultimately, I think even, like, some critics are probably willing to, like, look at this film and see the third act, and even if it may be indulgent, say, you know what, it's like, it's fun and it's referencing, and maybe it's not going to stand up and have the, like, longevity of something like The Shining, but in terms of, like, the moment to moment experiences that we're having, it's pretty fun to just see something like this exist.
I agree. One last thing before we get into it, and get into the spoilers. I felt like this was going to be one of my first real hot take episodes of the podcast, where I felt like I was sort of the outlier, just off of, like, all the stuff I was seeing, right, like online and stuff.
I came out of the movie thinking, and that's another thing, is I wanted to mention this before. I kept thinking about this, is the expectation that I went into this movie with was really high, because I was expecting a sequel to The Shining. I was tempering expectations, and then I saw nothing but praise. And I thought, oh my God, they pulled it off. They literally did the sequel to The Shining, and like everyone was talking about how it did justice to both the book and the movie, and just I had really high expectations, unfortunately, going in. So maybe that had something to do with my reaction to it as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we should engage with, and this is something that I think is getting a lot of focus, is reconciling Stephen King's issues with the Kubrick film and his novel, and how this movie is like a bridge that tries to unite the two, and I think a lot of people are giving it a lot of credit for that, right? Like if you're aware, if you're steeped in that and you're a huge Stephen King fan and you are sort of on his side in all this, you can see how this movie was an attempt to sort of unify the film version and the book version, and how it does a lot of work to join those two. And I think a lot of people give it a lot of credit for that. And I think it's definitely something interesting to talk about, but we will have to probably get into specifics to really get into it.
Yeah. I couldn't help but think which of the two artists was still alive, and like collaborating with somebody. Who are you going to collaborate with? Who are you going to lean towards? I couldn't help but feel like Flanagan was like, well, I've already adapted some other Stephen King stuff. I enjoy his, obviously we enjoy his stories. They're great stories. But like people also enjoyed like the difference of the Kubrick stuff. So although they did, lean into some of the Kubrick stuff, I think that with Stephen King still being alive and like getting his blessing on this movie, I think that it was there were steps being taken to kind of, like you said, like bridge the gap and make it more of like a Stephen King adaptation. Like, look, these are Stephen King stories.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, man. But we gotta move into this bio now.
Yeah. All right. So we're just gonna quickly go through this. Mike Flanagan, I think, has had a pretty meteoric ascension recently. He is an American filmmaker. He's known for his horror films, all of which he directed, wrote, and edited. Now, very specifically, that's interesting because he edits these, and I think when I was watching Dr. Sleep, I was thinking about that, and it's a very tightly edited film, and I think that like the tension is ratcheted up by the edit. I think that there's a lot of like, and he's having to follow up to the editing of Stanley Kubrick, who was notoriously meticulous, and like these like recreations of shots that he's doing and things like that. I don't know. I think it's really interesting when a filmmaker really takes the reins and says like, write, direct, and edit. That's massive. But the ones that he's known for, 2011, he directed Absentia. And then the first time I heard of him was Oculus in 2013. And that movie did pretty well, and I think people were kind of surprised by it. And then he got a deal with Netflix, and he made Hush. Have you ever heard of this one?
Heard of it, haven't seen it.
Yeah. I mean, I enjoyed it. It was a fun Netflix watch. Like it's like when you turn on Netflix and you find something fun to watch, and you're surprised. That one really surprised me, and I had a good time with it, like knowing what it was going in. Mm-hmm. And then he had Before I Wake, Ouija, Origin of Evil, which I haven't seen, but people really were into. Gerald's Game recently, which was the other King adaptation, and it was on Netflix as well. And then Dr. Sleep. So he really went from smaller horror films up to like basically is like we talked about. This was meant to be a blockbuster horror film.
Now I might be completely wrong about this, so we can edit it out if need be. But was he connected to the Haunting of Hill House show?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Okay, I thought so. I haven't seen that show either because we might cover it, so I've been putting it off. So it's funny because like I'm realizing I don't think I've seen any of his stuff. I think this is the first movie I've seen from Mike Flanagan.
Yeah, and like I would say that like he's becoming like the Stephen King adapter, right? Like he's had multiple at this point. Haunting of Hill House is like we missed it when it was initially coming out because we were covering something else. Yeah. But I think it'd be fun to revisit. I know a lot of people were super into it, and that's one that I've been dying to watch.
I've heard a lot of good things about that show.
Exactly. So I would love to at some point. So hopefully we get the chance. I think that it's really interesting to see a filmmaker come up and be like, I'm a horror director and stick to horror.
Yeah.
I think there's something nice about that. It's like, it's not to say that he can't branch out whenever he wants to, but like, I think that I love to see strong voices in horror.
Yeah, I agree with that. Cool. Yeah. I mean, it seems like an up and comer that is going to be one to watch as we go forward. Absolutely.
I just to talk about some of like what I was realizing, what I've heard at interviews, what he feels is important. In his directing, people have said that he focuses on character, themes. The horror lacks. There's not a lot of jump scares. It's like a very like old school style of horror, kind of like atmospheric horror. In an interview, he was talking about how, like, why he's so, like, he's always felt that like Stephen King was the beacon to look at when you're thinking of like character driven horror, and how like it's almost like the horror is like something that just is sprinkled into a Stephen King story because it's wrapped around addiction, or it's wrapped around like cycles of violence, things like this. So I think it's cool to see somebody who has that kind of a grasp on what makes strong horror films directing a Stephen King adaptation, because I feel like they're very much on the same wavelength. Whereas I feel like if you had asked Kubrick what he was trying to do, he was more interested in creating an experience and maybe less focusing on like building backstory and building motivations and things like that. But although like there are clearly motivations in that film, that's not to really take away from it. I just think that in terms of like Stephen King's criticism of Kubrick's The Shining as well, he just feels like there's not a lot of character there, or character arcs being delivered.
Well, specifically in Jack Torrance, we talked about that on our Shining coverage, which we had a lot of fun doing. But specifically, that King thought that Jack Torrance was demonstrably evil from the beginning and had sort of a flat arc throughout the movie. And we talked about how he was operating differently. But I don't know that I completely. I mean, you're not saying this, but I think Kubrick's Shining is sort of a character study too, though. If you just look at like the psychological terror and the domestic violence inherent in what we're watching unfold, and how uncomfortable it makes you. Because I think that's one of the key things that plays on your terror is the fact that you see a man abusing his family and how just visceral that is, right? And that's some of the darkest horror of The Shining, and that only works if you are really good at character.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like what I was saying maybe came off wrong. I think more of what I'm trying to say is like he has the characters in a different situation, right? Like he has his characters maybe in a different. I don't think that there's necessarily an arc that goes down as much as there's like a spiral. Like we're not seeing like victories that lead into like changes in character that lead into learning and developing and changing. Mm-hmm. It's more of just like having somebody already at the edge and then pushing them over the edge. And like seeing what that looks like and how terrifying that can be. So yeah, you're definitely right.
Yeah, man. All right, we got to get into spoilers here. I'm so ready.
All right, so I have a couple sections here. They're probably going to be pretty hefty chunks, but we'll try to talk about everything. So in 1980, sometime after escaping the Overlook Hotel, Danny Torrance and his mother Wendy live in Florida. Scarred by his experiences at the hotel, Danny is haunted by one of its ghosts, the rotting woman of room 237. Through The Shining, the ghost of Dick Halloran teaches him to lock up ghosts in imaginary boxes in his mind. Meanwhile, a cult of quasi-immortals known as the True Knot, led by Rose the Hat, feed on steam to slow their aging. In 2011, Danny, now going by Dan, is still traumatized by his time at the Overlook, and he's become an alcoholic to suppress his shining. He moves to a small town and befriends Billy Freeman, who gets him a job and becomes his AA sponsor. Dan begins to rehabilitate and soon finds a job at a hospice where there is a cat who goes to patients who are dying. Danny uses his shining abilities to comfort dying patients who give him the nickname Dr. Sleep. He also begins receiving telepathic communications from Abra Stone, a young girl whose shining is even more powerful than his.
Okay, yeah, that is a lot. But that's the setup. That's the setup for the movie, so I think that's a good place to jump in. So how did you, at the immediate question, how did you feel about the recasting of the iconic characters from The Shining with different actors but trying to evoke them, very, very strongly, right? Yeah,
I would say it's jarring. I don't think there's any way around it being jarring. It feels weird. I became used to it and didn't mind it as much, and I think I prefer this to like CGI, like de-aging, like or doing fake. Something weird to basically just like bring the characters back.
Because they could have put a deep fake over these actors' faces of the original, and it would have been real weird. But they could have probably done it. They have the tech. I don't know if there's like legality issues with that, but they probably could have done it.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. It's weird. It's like soulless robotic stuff. I don't know. It's like I think like I prefer this sort of recasting to the CGI like Uncanny Valley that we could be potentially have dropped into or something. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not gonna say it wasn't jarring, but I became accustomed to it, and ultimately it didn't ruin the movie for me.
I
How'd you
agree.
feel about it?
I agree with that. Initially, it was like, "Ooh, this is weird," like
Yeah.
seeing this person who's. I kept, and this is unkind, but I kept thinking of cosplay. I was like, "Oh, look, they're cosplaying as Wendy Torrance, and you know what I mean, as Dick
awesome.
Halloran." I couldn't stop thinking that. Like if I saw this person at a convention, I'd be like, "Oh, that's a really good, Dick Halloran or really good Wendy Torrance." And I struggled to get over the hump of like, no, this is them in this universe. But I was able to get there. And since we're in the spoiler section, I'm going to reference also later what the Jack Torrance we got was one of the other ones that I really struggled with, but was able to sort of accept. But like, yeah, I mean, it was essentially, to me, I kept thinking like, well, that's Jack Torrance cosplay, there it is. But it didn't feel like him in the way that I wanted it to, I guess. I struggled a little bit with it.
I agree with that. But I think they did something where they kind of lampshaded. It's like maybe it isn't him and they're trying to like evoke two characters at the same time and like get away with it in a way.
Okay, interesting.
That one was the hardest for me to I think deal with, was the Jack Torrance one.
Well, and also they kept showing iconic scenes from The Shining that they had reshot with the new actors.
Right. Again, a fun experiment. Like, I would love to do that. I would love to reshoot these scenes as well, but I don't know if it's necessarily needed.
And I think when you were talking about indulgent, that's some of the stuff that felt indulgent to me. Now, I understand, like, maybe they really feel like they need to remind the audience, but those scenes felt very bizarre to me.
I just almost felt like with this, we're already jumping all the way to the end, but I'm just going to leave it with this statement. I felt like this was a scenario where less could have been more. And I think like we got a lot at the end, and it could have been fun to get maybe a little less.
Yeah.
And that's something that we talked about in the other coverage, was like I had said like I was expecting more Shining stuff in Stephen King's book.
You mean more Overlook Hotel?
Overlook Hotel stuff more. And so we didn't really get very much of it, and then we got a lot of it here, so I feel like maybe there's like a middle ground somewhere that was missed.
Be careful what you wish for is something I wrote in my notes, because I remember in our book coverage at the end especially, I was talking about all the ways they could have more heavily involved the Overlook, and then I feel like this is like did it, and
right.
Maybe it was a little much, but anyway, let's focus more in the beginning here, because I do want to touch on again Rose the Hat, and a lot of the True Knot stuff was extremely good. Rebecca Ferguson stealing scenes, just captivating to watch. I thought Zan McLaren was good as Crow Daddy. He is someone who I have taken note of because of his performance in Westworld and Fargo, where I think he's really, really good. I do think he was maybe a little underutilized. I think he has potential to be significantly more menacing than he was even doing here. Just especially from like Fargo, what I've seen him do there. And I wish he could have maybe turned it up a notch or two. And I don't know if that's the character limitations or story limitations or what, but it's one of those things where like you see an actor in a role and you think they do a pretty good job, but you know that the actor is capable of so much more. And so you're a little sad that you didn't get it. And so I felt a little bit that way with him.
Yeah, I felt that like the main three roles in this movie were really well cast, and there was pretty good performances coming from all three. And then some of the, like you were kind of saying, maybe the other people didn't get quite enough material to really shine. Ha ha.
Ah, there you go.
And I wanted to talk about a couple of things though. With the start of the movie, the classic Kubrick score comes in, the WB shield that was in the 1980 version, and then the shots of like leading up to the Overlook, literally the exact same shots. I'm pretty sure, actually I know, I read that those are just the exact same shots converted to nighttime, and then digitally they put snow over top of them. I mean that in terms of like getting me excited for a movie. And
well, that stuff comes late. That stuff comes later in the movie, but yeah, like specifically the aerial shots. That comes when they're that's when they're going to the Overlook in the third act, right before they go.
I thought we started with a couple shots of like flying out across towards the island, and then we cut away, and then later on they come back and do more of the shots.
You're right. There might be a bit of both, but I think maybe originally it didn't have the darkness and the snow. It might have been more just like the same shot early on. I don't know. I have to see it again. That's a good. It's hard to remember some of the stuff at the very beginning of the movie, right? Because the stuff at the end is going to be freshest in your mind.
Yeah. So,
and I have only seen it once.
Yeah, I kind of wish I had been able to see it for a second time before recording, but that sort of opening really got me excited, and I was like, wow, this. I was because it was expectations were at an all-time high. I saw a lot of people talking positively about the movie and getting this sort of reference, and I was thinking like this, there would be like these massive like drops, and then later we get another scene that has like some pretty massive references, and I felt like that was where we were going to live, and then ultimately we dove much further than I thought we would.
Yeah, I agree. I was pumped. I heard that music and it got me excited, and I was on board. Absolutely.
How about the idea of navigating the fact that Halloran died in the film, and him coming back as like a shine ghost?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of clever, right? Like he was able to sort of keep the scene from the novel that was important, yet lean into the idea that he was dead in this version instead of being alive. And I think it worked, and honestly was fairly seamless, in my opinion. I don't think much was lost.
Yeah. We also, I think fairly early, we get the scene with Danny, who has gone to the new cities, and Fraser, and he meets the doctor, who has a massive role in the book.
Yeah.
And he does the whole "I know where your watch is" thing, and all of that was building to the same thing that was going to happen in the book. But I was surprised that he was relegated to a certain, because it was also a notable actor as well. It was Bruce Greenwood, who I recognized and was like,
yeah,
oh, this is a pretty massive actor who could be in this role. And then instead of taking on the role, there's a scene where we're in his office when Dan is trying to become an orderly, or he's offering him an orderly job, which like right away I noticed that this is like Ullman's office from the original Shining.
Absolutely.
And I'm like pointing, I'm like turned to the next person next to me, I'm like pointing, I'm like, look, it's the room.
Now, another good question though is like, why?
Yeah.
Why was...
No, I mean, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. It's a fun reference, but it felt weird because it was like, not even Overlook related. It was just kind of there to be like, remember the scene where all this stuff happens?
Yeah. And that's kind of my issue with it. It was a reference for reference sake. And it didn't seem to have much other, like, because it wasn't a clue about the character that we could use that to even learn anything about this guy, because he was really like Ullman in almost no way. So there's not much thematically being lined up there. The only thing that I could maybe say is that Jack Torrance was sort of like going into a new direction for his life when he accepts the job, and that here Danny is moving into a new direction, that he's becoming sober, but opposite directions in the sense that Jack Torrance was moving into his own destruction and something terrible, whereas Danny is like reclaiming his life. So in that sense, very different too.
Yeah, it seemed like it was, I don't know. I guess the only other thing really is just that it was, Kubrick did a lot to make people feel uneasy when watching The Shining. Maybe this was a decision that Flanagan made in order to be like, maybe this will make people feel weird and like this shouldn't be happening. And like, I agree with you that it doesn't really necessarily make the most sense, but I didn't hate it. I just thought it was weird.
Yeah. Now, I mean, we also get the scene of Danny at first being terrified of the woman in the bathtub as a child, and then learning about the box thing, and then immediately sort of challenging and like confidently going into the bathroom, capturing the ghost, and walking out, and sort of quickly moving on from this. And this sort of happens in the book too. So this isn't solely a movie thing, but to me, it sort of weakened that being and its power. How easily he was able to flip a switch on it.
Well, I feel like with a lot of this early stuff, I don't know if you felt the same way, but I felt like, although this movie is long, I felt like there was a lot of it in terms of the story that was being rushed through.
Oh yeah,
and I feel like
we got to talk about the darkest moment in Danny's life, and what we get on the screen. Yeah,
right, and that's what I was leading to, is this sort of, I think it's built up for a longer period of time. It's a pretty significant chunk of the book that we're with Danny, and we're seeing his struggles with alcoholism and how low he is, and like, I just felt like we really blew by that. I don't know if we really got the significance of that for an audience who maybe didn't read the book. I don't know if we really understood how low Dan was, and how, like, I mean, I guess, saying like alcoholism and AA and like he had to get sober is like a shorthand way of saying like he was tortured, but I really didn't feel like we got the same impact as we had in the book.
I agree. And that was one of the things I think was lacking a little bit, but ultimately, it still works. It's like shifts the focus a little bit. I think his experiences at the Overlook are reframed as sort of the central darkest moment of his life that he is struggling with as an adult. And so the focus gets shifted to that more than what it is in Doctor Sleep, whereas it is a dark time in his life, but his darkest moment is actually what goes on with that woman and that child. So we get into it more in the book episodes, but I think you kind of had to do that because of how different the ending is for Danny's arc, which we can get into too as we get there.
And we also didn't really get, we didn't get the callback as many times. It was really important for Stephen King to call back like a lot of times, and we really only saw it one other time, I believe.
Yeah, there was one reference to them being ghosts. And I wonder how clear it is. Now, I've only seen the movie once, but I wonder how clear it is to audience goers that she was dead and that child were dead and blaming him.
Right, and then it wasn't just some sort of weird shining dream that he was having.
Exactly. It wasn't just some sort of nightmare shining thing, but they were actually dead. Because that, I think, changes that scene pretty dramatically depending on how you read it.
Yeah. So I wanted to move into the next part here. In 2019, the True Knot are starving. They abduct a young boy named Bradley and torture him to death to extract as much steam as they can. A teenage Abra senses the events, and her distress alerts both Dan and Rose. Rose sets her sights on Abra, planning to extract her steam to sustain the cult. Realizing that Rose is after her, Abra visits Dan, who insists that she stay away and avoid drawing attention to herself. That night, Rose astral projects into Abra's mind, but is stunned when the girl manages to trap her and briefly enter Rose's mind. Wounded, Rose returns to her body and sends the True Knot to capture Abra.
Okay, so this is some of my absolute favorite stuff in the movie. Some of these scenes are just fucking cool. And like the psychic battle stuff was like so well done. That's the stuff I'm going to remember from this movie. I think honestly, that's the memorable moments that was unique. That was just really, really well done.
Yeah, and like Rose that like astral projecting and flying across the world and all that
so
stuff.
Good.
Like that was
the way
really cool.
She like landed on the street and stuff after like twisting of the world, and like all that looks so fucking good.
I thought all of that was going to be the hardest thing for them to pull off as well. Like that, all of that to me felt like that was like, oh, this is going to be really hard to like make an audience understand in like just a visual way.
Yep.
And totally nailed it, like you said. That it was really
and like
fun
when
cool.
she screamed to throw Rose out of her mind, and when she's in the supermarket and the glass exploding, and like the power of that moment was captured so well. And then that's really also good. When she's the same scream, she like puts red rum into Danny's wall, which is like, I mean, that's fun. Like, I think that's a cool change. It didn't happen in the book, and like sort of like calling back. He's like, all right, I think it like signals to the audience in a quick way that it's like, all right, this is like Shining related, and like I'm dealing with my past because of this, and like it was fucking cool too because it wasn't red rum. She put murder. Yet he sees red rum because he's looking in a mirror, which is just that is excellent. That is a really, really good callback, but different, right? Like it's an inverse. So good. Right.
Yeah, that was awesome. Really like that stuff. So I think I would say like this is like this, like you were saying, this is a huge chunk where it was just like Mike Flanagan really showing, like stretching his wings and showing like how great of a film of a like horror director he is, and like just building up all this tension and like making us care about the characters, and this part was really, really fun.
Yeah, and like when she gets thrown back all the way across and into her body and goes flying off the roof, like the way that all seamlessly was cut together and made sense, and man, that was so good. So many things to praise here, but I did want to ask you a question. Okay. It felt to me like, because we don't get Daenerys Targaryen in this movie, right? But it felt like it was referencing an anime, because I noticed there were anime posters on the wall for, I want to say it was like 4 letters, and I forget what they are. Do you know what they are?
Yeah, it's Ruby, RWBY.
BY. Okay, so I have not seen that anime. Have you seen it?
I'm familiar with it. I actually haven't seen very much of it, but it's interesting because it's an American anime. It's not like from a Japanese studio or anything like that. It's American made, and it's actually Rooster Teeth produced it.
Oh, interesting. So I assumed it was referencing a character in that. Is that to be accurate?
From what I understand, there's a character who like can manipulate thoughts and things, very similar to like getting in somebody's head in The Shining.
Okay. Are they eyeless or something? Is that why she was eyeless, or was that just to be scary?
Oh, I don't think the eyeless thing. No, I don't think so. But maybe. But I think it's specifically just like the mental telepathic power type stuff that they're referencing.
Yeah. Anyway, cool. And I kind of figured they wouldn't be able to probably secure the rights to something like Game of Thrones.
Right.
And maybe that would have just been too, like, it might take you out of it, honestly.
I honestly just thought that they were going to be more, it was going to be like generic girl on a dragon kind of thing. You know,
Right.
I was expecting a dragon to show up, but maybe not necessarily like Drogon.
Yeah. Well, she doesn't ride. She rides like a Pegasus or something in the book, right? So yeah, I kind of like that they went a different route with it, honestly, and I thought it worked well. So no complaints there.
Yeah, and we're talking about favorite moments, so there's no way we can overlook this part. There is the baseball boy who's abducted.
Oh yeah, dark, man, brutal. He fucking went there with that scene.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Jacob Tremblay, I don't know if you're familiar with like Room, but the actor who played this little boy is like the most legendary child actor right now. Like they got him to like
Really? No, I haven't seen Room.
Yeah, so he absolutely killed it again, and I actually have a really funny like behind the scenes thing to read here. According to director Mike Flanagan, the performance of Michael Tremblay during the first take of his death scene was so intense that it surprised and scared the other actors, including Rebecca Ferguson, who was so horrified she was stammering and couldn't get her lines out. When the scene was over, a grinning Tremblay jumped up, covered in fake blood, high-fived his father, and walked over to the craft services to get a snack, leaving Ferguson and the rest of the cast shell-shocked and traumatized.
Man, that is awesome. I love that.
Yeah, it's so cool just to know like that. I mean, this kid is a brilliant actor.
Wow.
And just like at the age that he's at, and to have cast him in this role and this absolutely horrific. This will be the scene that sticks with me for sure. Like this sort of like murder scene that happens here. Like I was like, all right, they're gonna cut into him, and then they're gonna cut. He's gonna scream, and they're gonna cut away. Did not happen like that. They lingered. We saw it all happen. They were sucking out his steam. It was gruesome.
Yeah, and honestly, perfect rendition of what goes down in the book. Like it's just like that, and it's just as brutal.
And I also wanted to shout out Kylie Curran, who plays Abra. Like I felt like her screaming after in the scene as well was just as intense and really matched like what was going on there. And I think she's a great talent. I think we're going to see her in a lot of stuff here. I was really impressed with her in this movie.
I agree, and she does badass well. She does that sort of like the character is so strong and like angry at what's happening, and uses that and uses her power and is scary in that sense, in a way. And I think she nailed all of that, throughout. And then I don't know if we've technically got to it yet, but the scene where Danny is forced to locate her, and then he finally gets to talk to her, and then they do the swap, and Danny is in her body. Her performance of that is very, very good. That's a hard thing to do. Like I am now an adult in my body, and man, that was good. Yeah, exactly. People were laughing.
People in my theater were laughing and cheering, and like they were really into when Danny like took over her body and like the attitude she was giving the crow.
And that's like some of the best stuff with Zan McClarnon too. Like I think that was some of the chance he got to the way he was interacting with her, and how he sort of all of a sudden realized that the tables had been turned on him, and that you can see sort of this creeping fear, and all this stuff was very, very good. And then I love the idea of the car crash killing him.
So this is another pretty large chunk here. The cat leads Dan to an empty room where he has another visit from Halloran, who instructs him to protect Abra. Abra tells Dan what happened with Rose and says she can track the cult if she can touch Bradley's baseball glove. Dan tells Billy about the Shining, and they travel to the murder scene and exhume Bradley's body to retrieve his glove. Then they go to Abra's house, where they recruit her father Dave and devise a plan. Using an astral projection of Abra as bait, Dan and Billy lure the cult members out and shoot most of them dead, though Snakebite Andy, before dying, telepathically manipulates Billy into killing himself.
And that was a big change. And honestly, as sad as it was, I think it's a good one. I think it really shows the power of Andy. It shows how dangerous, like it's, you think about like the cornered animal being dangerous. In this moment, she's dangerous because she's literally dying, but is able to lash out. The one thing I guess I kind of wanted a little more of was I wanted to see Danny's grief over this moment. But I think it gets sort of swept up in him losing Abra. And so, although we see him almost drink again, it's kind of unclear whether or not he's reacting to Billy dying or Abra being missing and what weight each thing is being given. And so it's a little confusing. Whereas I really wanted to see him react to the death of his friend who essentially saved his life a little more.
and this is jumping ahead a little bit, but also Dave, the Abra's father, gets killed here in a little bit. And so it's like the kind of combination of both of those things happening, and neither Abra or Danny really dealing with that in any like significant way.
Abra did not seem to have any real. I mean, she at the end we get the nod to it, and she says that he went on and stuff, but still, like, that's her dad is dead, so.
Right.
I don't know. It felt a little off from the emotional truth that I was expecting there.
Yeah, I would say, like I mentioned in the book coverage, one thing that I really felt like was lacking was just that this idea they got one over on Rose so many times, and they never suffered any losses. They never really had many hardships through the book, and like it seems like they came out pretty unscathed. And here it's like I think Flanagan kind of felt the same way reading the story and saying like, all right, well, there needs to be some sort of loss in some way. But yeah, there wasn't any significance. There wasn't any moment of them dealing with it. So it's like I think the killing was maybe for shock value, and then there was maybe an intention to give Danny and the drinking. I think is a combination of everything. Obviously, like his almost drinking, but I think this is kind of a moment where he changed what Stephen King did, and I think that it was for the better, but it didn't necessarily follow through. And it's probably because a large chunk of this ending here is spent being a Shining homage.
Right. So one of the other major differences I thought was the way that shootout goes down at the campsite. There was a lot more True Knot there. They were all armed. They all had handguns. There's a big shootout. We get a little bit of some sharpshooting from our characters here, fairly efficiently killing like 6 members of the True, in a way that maybe stretches a little bit of credibility if you really think about it, who these characters are, and they're just the fashion way they can quickly shoot them all. And honestly, I kept remembering how real this scene felt in Stephen King's hand in the book, and how sort of movie cinematic in sort of the cliche way, right? Like people say, like, this felt very, very Hollywood, in a sense. And I don't know. I guess that's a minor criticism I have for it. I get why it was changed. I get they wanted to take out a lot of the True here so they didn't have to worry about them later. But it just seemed very easy to kill all of them.
Yeah. To continue on, Rose's lover Crow Daddy kills Dave and abducts Abra, drugging her to suppress her shine. Dan communicates with Abra, who allows him to possess her temporarily and force Crow Daddy to crash his car, killing him and freeing Abra. While Dan and Abra reunite, Rose consumes the cult's remaining stockpile of steam, healing her wounds and vowing revenge for their deaths. Dan decides to return to the abandoned Overlook, believing it as a dangerous place for Rose as it is for him and Abra. He starts up the hotel's boiler and explores the building, awakening it in the process. Dan revisits the rooms where his father, Jack, influenced by the Overlook, attempt to murder him and Wendy. At the hotel bar, Dan is offered alcohol by Lloyd, his father, now a ghost bartender. Once Rose arrives at the hotel, Dan and Abra confront her by pulling her into the astral plane in the form of the Overlook's hedge maze. After a failed attempt to trap her in one of the boxes, Dan instructs Abra to flee before being overpowered by Rose. As she drains his steam, Dan releases the Overlook's ghost from his boxes, who proceed to surround and kill Rose. However, the ghost possesses Dan, who begins to hunt for Abra. When she manages to momentarily free him, he tells her to flee the hotel. Struggling with possession, Dan returns to the boiler room, which becomes engulfed in flames. In his last moment, Dan sees a vision of himself as a child being embraced by his mother, Wendy. Abra watches helplessly as the hotel burns down. Yeah.
Okay. So that is a lot you've just covered there. Before we get into all this stuff of the Overlook, just because I know that's going to dominate the rest of our conversation, there was a moment where when Danny and Abra, I think this is way back when they first meet, Danny says, he's talking about The Shining. He says, I used to call it Tony. I thought it was my imaginary friend, but he essentially says it was just The Shining. It was his power. Mm-hmm. And I was let down by that moment because I loved how mysterious Tony is as a figure. And I felt like King maintained that mystery a little bit in Dr. Sleep. He never quite defined what Tony exactly was. And here it just felt like, oh, there's this mystery of The Shining that was never solved. Let me just go ahead and in a line wave it off, right? Like, oh, it's just my power, and that was all it was.
Right.
I don't know. I just wasn't a big fan of that.
Well, yeah, I agree with that for sure. It's just like leave it a mystery,
Yeah.
and you know, I think when he said that, I felt like that was a moment where he was saying like it was just my power, but then it was going to turn out that it wasn't just his power at the end. You know, I felt like it was maybe one of these moments where it was like misleading in order to like deliver a surprise later.
Could we have seen Tony at the end, or an outline of? Because remember, sometimes you would see this like silhouette of shadow that would be Tony in the original Shining. Like I would have liked to see something like that. Yeah, something mysterious at the end.
Yeah. So the decision to return to the Overlook, I feel like that's exactly the reason why I kind of said it in our book coverage. I was like, I felt like Rose was going to go to the Overlook in order to like use the Overlook as a conduit, kind of. In the book coverage, I said like she would use like the things that happened there, but it's kind of like Danny doing that. Like Danny's basically saying like I'm gonna awaken the hotel. I mean, it's like the moments of him walking through and like like kind of awakening and everything. Like it's indulgent. It was so much fun to see this sort of version of the events, and like it was really mesmerizing to see these sets again and to see the characters and think about the significance of everything that went on. You know, as much as I'm probably going to say a lot of things that I didn't like about some of the stuff that happens here, like I felt like the walk through the Overlook, as long as it was, and it was long, it was like 5 minutes of him just walking around doing stuff. It was still, you know, those places just in my mind have such a special connotation, like a special place. So to see it again just on film in general, I think was at least worth the price of admission.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, I thought the reason to go back to the Overlook was flimsy at best. The idea that this was a weapon they could use against Rose, and clearly this is what we have to do, and I'm going to go in alone and wake it up, and like there was all this stuff that like it I think it just heavily relied on like an elbow nudge and a wink, like, yeah, he's got to do this, right? Because we all are here to see it. Like that, it's like it relies on you as an audience member knowing that, like, yeah, well, we got to find a way to get him here, right? Like that's why we're all here.
Yeah, I felt like it was like he could have released those boxes at any time. He didn't need to be at the Overlook, so it's like he could have weaponized them at any point.
Yeah, it just. To me, it didn't even, it almost didn't even try, because it was just like, just go with it. It was really what I felt like it was saying, and I think a lot of people were able to. And that's when I say that like this final act really felt like it got very campy in that sense. Like it sort of knew that like we're all here to celebrate The Shining, and we're all here to sort of revel in the references and revel in the nostalgia. And so it just leaned really heavily into that, and kind of hand waved a lot of story, you know, plot holes you might be able to raise up. It just kind of was like, whatever, just go with it.
Yeah, and as much as I appreciate some of the things that are set up that are done as direct homages and like specific like references and Easter eggs and things that are going on in here, this is where I meant, this is what I said about like, it felt like Ready Player One a little bit. Like it really felt like this was like some sort of like, let's go in and let's check it out, and it's a great movie, but let's like dip our hands in and like do something different and really like, I don't know. I don't want to say it's not like, you know, it doesn't ruin anything for me, but it does feel like it's like, it just feels like something that was written as a fan. You know, it doesn't feel like there's any significant story to be told here other than maybe closing up off the boiler situation.
So that's really interesting, because I think this movie strongly tries to reconcile, we talked about this earlier, reconcile the original Shining book with the Shining film. And the way it does that is it essentially takes Danny Torrance and it gives him Jack Torrance's final moments from the original Shining. And what you have to do in order to do that is you have to take Danny Torrance's arc and shift it from what we got in the book and into a story about him taking on the guilt and the mantle of his father and paying for his father's sins in sort of a martyr sense. Right. Which, if you remember the novel, spoiler for the novel, it's very different. He instead is able to rise above. He's able to shake free of this weight. He talks about his darkest moment to the AA group and is able to have a happy ending where he moves on and he grows. So, and not linked to his father in that sense. Because his father had already done it, right, in the world of the novel. So it changes Danny Torrance's character arc pretty fundamentally, and that's why I struggled to say that it was a really, really good adaptation of Dr. Sleep, because if you really like that character arc and like where it left him, this is a fundamental change. And in a way, it's gonna, whether or not you like it, I think is gonna determine how strong you feel like it was a good adaptation of Dr. Sleep.
There's a couple things here that like really with Danny's arc in the film that they tried to they just skewed him slightly, like inching him over and over and over until he was like not really having the same arc as the book, like you're saying. Like I remember specifically, there's this sort of moment where he's at the AA meeting and he's getting one of his chips and he's talking about how like this is for Jack Torrance, and he's kind of like talking about how Jack Torrance attempted AA.
Yeah.
And attempted to do all of this stuff. And I think it's changing what we know about Jack Torrance, and it changes what's going on with Danny, and it's showing like he's dealing more, maybe even in this movie, than he was in the book with like what went on at the Overlook. Clearly because King didn't want to retell a story at the Overlook. Right. But in this way, it's setting up for a confrontation that we get with Jack Torrance. Or like some spirit of Jack Torrance that's lingering in the Overlook.
Which we should probably say, like, if you haven't listened to our previous episodes on the book, first off, like, you can to get more details, but essentially, the Overlook burned down in the original Shining. The boiler exploded and burned down, much like we see at the end here. So because of that, in the Dr. Sleep book, they go back to the same area that the Overlook was, but the building itself is gone. So almost everything you see inside the Overlook Hotel in the film is a complete invention for the movie and not something that was in the book. So I think that's worth noting if you're someone who maybe hasn't read the book.
Right. So let's talk about this Jack scene where he goes to the bar and he's tempted by the hotel to drink. Yeah. I think it's very clearly the same scene that we see in The Shining. Yep. Again, fun to see something like that.
Indicating that Jack got absorbed by the hotel and given the job that the previous caretaker had been given, who killed his family, and sort of like Lloyd, maybe this is the cycle that we got, right? Although you're mixing a little bit of bartender versus like he was a waiter, so there's like it's kind of like they're taking two characters and blending them, because the bartender was not the previous caretaker, it was the waiter, but it doesn't really matter, I don't think, too much.
Lloyd was the character that Jack Torrance interacts with, and like he looked like the person who was basically Jack before, like the person who went crazy in the Overlook before Jack. We hear a small story about that, and so like as we see Jack went crazy and he took over this role, and it's funny because they play with it where it's like, is this entity aware that it's Jack Torrance, or is it just the hotel? It does become angry at one point and drink the shot, and so that leads me to think like it's got some of Jack.
Call him a pup and do some stuff that's referencing the book, and you got to take.
It's got some of Jack in there.
There was like, and honestly, like I liked there was a very like I think there were some lines from the original Shining, but I'd have to reread it again to really know for sure. But when he was saying that how like, having a wife and having a kid and how it drains on you, and the only thing you can do is like take medicine to combat it, and so you take your medicine, and like I felt like that was some of the dark shit that we got in the book. Coming out of his mouth here.
Yeah. So ultimately, I think it was jarring, to say the least, to see another actor playing Jack Torrance. It was hard. I don't even really know if I got the full effect of the scene because I was so in shock of it, and I would like to see it again for that reason. But I guess I don't know, I just felt like this was a clear point where I felt like less would have been more. I feel like Stephen King just had the one moment of like a wave from Jack Torrance, and I think that maybe having less of Jack Torrance would have helped out, not only just because he was recast, but also just it seemed like a lot, and it was like kind of confusing because it's like not really him, it's just the hotel trying to play tricks on him, but is it him? It was a long scene, and I think that like in an already long movie, this whole Overlook portion here is like they take their time, and I was just surprised at how much we got of like Jack Torrance here, and you talked about before like Jack Torrance running through the maze with the axe and everything, recast, like having a recast actor doing that again. It seemed like a lot. Like it was jarring to show so much of the recast actors.
Well, and like we know how much Stanley Kubrick pushed Jack Nicholson and
Shelley Duvall and
Shelley Duvall, to get the performances he got, to get the terror that Shelley Duvall is able to so perfectly portray, and to get the madness out of Jack Nicholson that is iconic. And it just like, I don't know, I don't know how much they put into it, but it was not the same. And you could tell that this wasn't a person at the verge of madness, and instead it was a visual recreation of a scene. And that's what it felt like.
Yeah, I want to move into some of the stuff with Rose to specifically talk about like how this movie goes down. So Rose enters the hotel and realizes, and when Abra comes in with Danny before Rose comes in, and they end up on the staircase. And this was another moment that was just like pretty indulgent, pretty on the nose, where like they're both standing on the staircase. Danny's got the axe waiting for Rose as she comes in. We've got the typewriter.
He's backing up as she's menacing and following him up and doing similar hand motions and all of that.
Yeah. All that stuff. I mean, look, in terms of like swapping the roles and having like somebody with the axe, like above, like moving away from Rose the Hat, I think it's interesting. I think that it's something.
And it plays out differently because he goes to hit her but doesn't work, and instead he gets thrown, which is the inverse of what happens in The Shining. But yeah, it felt too obvious, too on the nose. And I don't know, man, like some people might see that and just go, oh, cool. It's just like that scene, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't let myself feel that because I was left wanting, and it's interesting because like you keep talking about Ready Player One and I kept going to it as well. And there was I gave Ready Player One a pass because I kept feeling like fundamentally Ready Player One knows what it is and knows that it is empty references.
Yeah, the whole story is about like indulgence.
Yeah, it's exactly. Yeah, it's about nostalgia, and it's about like the love of fans recreating things and how the world has been taken over by fans essentially, and or a major one fan. But regardless, like this, it was like I wanted more than that, and so I wasn't able to forgive that sort of indulgent scene in the way that I was able to sort of either forgive or even celebrate it in Ready Player One.
Yeah. So we get the moment where Danny unleashes all of the Overlook ghosts from his mind and unleashes everything, and they swarm on Rose and they basically kill her there. Yeah. I don't know if they brought her into the hotel as well, I guess, consumed her.
And you get the forever and ever and ever line, and this is the stuff that it was just like, hey, remember this? Hey, remember this? Hey, look at this guy. You remember him? He says this thing that he said in the movie. I don't know, man. None of these entities felt as terrifying, even close, as they were in the original. That even goes for the naked bathtub woman who probably gets the most screen time and is shown to be pretty frightening. But even that, it just doesn't have the same effect. And I think it's because it's the way it's employed and the way it is sort of quickly resolved. In a lot of sense. And you got. What did you think of the whole big box thing and the maze scene and it creeping up behind her to close her and stuff? It was kind of Pac-Man-y.
I like that stuff actually because I feel like that's like more in line with some of the Dr. Sleep stuff, like the stuff we see inside of inside of Rose's mind, inside of Abra's mind, being inside of Danny's mind. Like of course, like his fortress would be like the labyrinth, like the maze, and like I thought that was pretty cool.
He bested the Minotaur.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. That stuff was pretty good.
And like her thinking that she had Abra had changed her mind in order to create a new defense, but realizing that it was actually Danny, and she's like freaking out about how she never found Danny and how they would have consumed him and how he's so powerful even as an adult. I just think it was fun. It was interesting, but then we get into a situation where the ghosts turn after consuming Rose. And they turn and they consume Danny.
Yep.
And not before Rose hits him in the leg, which I thought was a dick shot for sure. I thought she cut his wiener off.
It's supposed to be the femoral artery. So we get so it's also the implication that he was going to die anyway.
Right.
Which in some sense kind of lessens what happens later to me.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I felt like I do both. I felt the same way. But so it consumes him, but only one of his eyes turns to that sort of shine moment, and he's like going around with the axe.
So I think that was sort of a reference to the book, and also maybe the miniseries. Although I remember seeing part of it, I haven't rewatched it, and I want to. We've been talking about maybe doing that as a bonus episode. But I think Mike Flanagan has even said that he was in some ways trying to also be a sequel to the miniseries, as if he needed another thing to be a sequel to.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of some of like screenshots I've seen of how Jack Torrance looked in that version.
Okay.
Right, just sort of very monstrous looking. Eyes have changed, and that's a throwback to the book where Danny says to his father, "You aren't Jack. You're just a mask." And then we literally get Abra say the same thing to him here in a direct callback to that scene that was omitted from the Kubrick film.
Yeah. You just reminded me of something, by the way, just the idea of Stephen King coming around on some Kubrick stuff. Do you feel like Flanagan was trying to bridge a gap by also trying to make Jack Torrance, having gone to AA, seem more sympathetic, and in that way showing that he had some remorse and didn't want to kill his family right away? Do you feel like that was his way of like in another way trying to make Kubrick and Stephen King come together?
I think that is a great reading of the character from the book. Whether or not you can say that safely about the Jack Torrance we saw in the movie, it's tough to say. But yeah, he's trying to link the two, and I agree with that.
You mentioned the Abra scene. I did like the masked face thing. The moment you actually mentioned it in our last book episode for the Dr. Sleep. You mentioned the moment that you felt like there was going to be a mask reference or something like that, and it was here.
Yeah, and so he's essentially a thing. He's like a Jack thing. Essentially, at the end, he's fully transformed into his father in this moment where he's coming after Abra with the axe.
Yeah, and like you said before, this is some of the Ewan McGregor's I felt weaker stuff. Like when he was doing the transforming from being Danny and then transforming back into sort of like Jack Danny. That moment, I wish that they would have had a couple more. I don't know, takes of that or something. And use a different.
It got
take.
Real silly in my opinion.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are many things Ewan McGregor is very, very good at as an actor, and I am a fan of his. Doing the madness that Jack Nicholson is so good at, that sort of madness and that sort of menace is just not really something that's in his wheelhouse, and unfortunately, or it didn't feel like it was drawn out of him in the way that maybe someone else could. Maybe someone else could have gotten that from him, but I didn't see it here.
And speaking of Ewan McGregor as like a great, one of our finest actors currently working, I was thinking like some of the early stuff when I knew Ewan McGregor was going to play Danny. I was thinking that some of the early stuff with him and his addiction and all that stuff would be like Trainspotting. Have you seen Trainspotting?
I have.
Classic, yeah. So like that's sort of like, I thought they were going to go like to that extent where it was like it was going to feel a little bit like
we got a taste of it maybe, but not
a taste
but not
of it.
Yeah.
But so that I just kept thinking of that, and then of course there were moments of me thinking of Obi-Wan and like all kinds of other stuff that Ewan McGregor's done, and he's a great actor, and I love
He's just
him.
a big teddy bear, man, and so it's so hard to be scared of him. Like I just wasn't ever scared of him. I don't know, man. I never bought that he was going to hurt her. That's the thing, man. Like there's some real just danger in the stakes of this man who is trying to murder his own family in the Shining, and they try and sort of slap it together here at the end with the threatening of Abra, but I never felt like she was in any real danger. And I think for this scene to really work, you have to do it, and maybe they just didn't have enough time or what have you to set it up. But also with the over the top makeup, it removes the familiarity, and it makes it obvious to us and Abra that this isn't actually him. Whereas what would be really truly terrifying is if she thought maybe this is really him, but it never really gets into that territory. So in a lot of ways, this scene just didn't work for me, and it's really the culmination of the movie in a lot of sense. And so one of the things I think that left me feeling very mixed about this film is probably this scene, or at least it's a microcosm of a larger issue.
And this leads into something that I think, like we've talked about, is interesting. He chases her and eventually like goes to the boiler, right? And this is like that he.
Well,
sits
she even
down
says
and,
like there's one thing you forgot, and that's that he turned on the boiler, and it's very reminiscent of the same sort of thing that happens in The Shining, where Danny reminds the Jack thing that the boiler, that you forgot about the boiler, and then it's like, oh shit, and has to run down there.
Yep. And so we see, yeah, and then Danny kind of becomes himself again at the last minute, having beaten this thing, and like, or like the thing realizes that it's not going to be able to get out, or it's not going to be able to stop the boiler from going over, and Abra gets out, and then the whole thing goes up. And I think I mentioned in our book coverage how I thought that Danny was going to die at the end, and then in this case, Danny does die. Yeah. How did you feel about the change?
It's him taking on his father's guilt. It's him taking on his father's crimes. It gives a sense of justice to people who felt like maybe there was an injustice vacuum at the end of The Shining. And it ties a lot of things up that maybe have been, for a long time not tied up. And I don't know how I feel about that, honestly, because there's something to be said for a movie that leaves you feeling like there wasn't justice served, and that even though we see Jack freeze to death at the end of The Shining, he's still like the Overlook persists, whereas here the Overlook is destroyed, and so you get that sort of bow that is put on the story, and you feel like it has come to an end now. And that's one of the things that King didn't like. He had a story where the Overlook burned down. He had a story that ended in fire, and sort of a cleansing fire, and that's exactly what we see here now. And in a lot of ways, it felt like Flanagan was stepping in and doing a lot of the work that King originally intended for his book. And it's that conflict between Kubrick's version and King's version. And we give all the credit in the world to King because he's the creator of this story, and he is full within his rights to want it to end the way that he wants it to end. And that is all true. However, when you're also writing the sequel to the movie, you are also engaging with Kubrick's legacy, and this in many ways just did not feel like a sort of movie that Kubrick would co-sign. Like, if Kubrick was alive, I don't know that he would like this movie.
Well, that's kind of what I meant with like leaning towards who is alive, and like who are you trying to kind of make happy in this situation. I think Stephen King was made to feel a lot happier than Kubrick would have been.
Yep, I agree. And so I think if you're a big Kubrick fan, I think if you like The Shining for its art house nature, if you like The Shining for being weird and unresolved, this movie's going to come in and rub you the wrong way in a lot of the choices it makes.
I was so sure we were going to see that photo of the party from the end of The Shining where Jack is in the photo. I thought for sure we were going to see Danny like see that photo and be like, holy shit, he was here in 1920, and like try to figure out, you know what I mean? Because that's like one of those unresolved, what the fuck does that even mean moments.
Yeah, but Shining. They never look at it. Well, I mean, like, and that does remind me of a moment where we see Rose look down the hallway and see the blood coming out of the elevator, and then she's like, oh. Yeah, and like that just felt so indulgent to me because it was like served no purpose. It is truly just like we got to have this, right? And we got to have her see it. I don't know. Those kind of scenes all felt indulgent to me, like you said earlier. So I don't know, man. I feel like we've hit on a lot of stuff. I don't have much else. I feel like we're hammering this movie in some sense. But I do want to remind you how much we love the middle of this movie, and we love Rose the Hat, and how we're fans of the book. We both really like the book. And we like a lot of the adaptation here. I think is very good. But yeah, I mean, this was a weird movie for me, and it was one that I really struggled to wrap my head around.
I feel like if we didn't really do our due diligence and compare it to The Shining and kind of give The Shining its due at the same time, people would be kind of call bullshit. So I hope that people understand that. Like I ultimately did enjoy this movie. I like I said, I was very mixed on it, but there were things that I liked about it, things I didn't like, and that's okay. I think I'd be interested to hear what anybody else had to say about it. If you want to write in, inktofilm@gmail.com.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes down to taste. We're truly getting into because some people don't like art house movies. Some people or maybe feel like they're snobby or the implication, they don't like the implication that if you don't like the art house movie that you're not intelligent or something. And there's a lot of baggage with a lot of these discussions that can go in, and it's okay to like this movie for what it is, and I think it's great. And I don't want to rain on anyone's parade who feels that way. But all I can do, in this kind of situation is kind of speak the truth of how I felt. And you know what I mean? Because ultimately anything else is a lie from me, and anything else is me trying to put on airs or something that I don't actually believe. So I had to sort of come in here and defend it, and it made me really realize that I do love The Shining I think in our 100th episode talking about greatest adaptations, I might have even said The Shining was my favorite adaptation of all time, right? I think I did. So it was at least in my top 2 or 3 or something. So you know what I mean? Like I can't say that and then come in here and not recognize that in a lot of sense, like this wasn't a great sequel, in my opinion, to the movie of The Shining. All it really did was reference it a ton. But in a lot of ways, it did a lot to undermine the message and the vision of Kubrick's version of that story.
So sometime later, Abra talks to Dan's spirit, assuring each other that they will be okay before he disappears. Abra is confronted by the ghost of the rotting woman from the Overlook, but now is prepared to lock up the ghost just as Danny did. So she like walks in and shuts the door and gonna lock her away. You know, I appreciate it for what it was trying to say, like sort of that the torch had been passed. You know, Danny he had made right by Halloran and he paid his debt like he was asked to. Yeah, I mean, I think with the boiler exploding and like Danny going down, there's something beautiful about the merging of the two. I do like the idea that like this time around, the boiler takes it down and it's this nice like closing chapter for both the book and the movie. And then Abra having her moment here to show that like she's capable and she's going to go forward and handle things.
Yeah, and I think we got hints of an extended universe, which we've talked about. We got hints of there are other people out there like me or like Rose, but worse. Mm-hmm. There's even a line where he says something like there are people who stand, which made me think directly of the book The Stand, which is being adapted, and I wondered if he was in some way referencing that, which I know you haven't read, but that would be something to keep in mind as we go forward and maybe cover that in the future.
Yeah, I was listening to Flanagan talk about just Stephen King and like adaptations that he would like to do. And he mentioned like Dark Tower is the one that always struck him and he always would have wanted to do that, but he felt like it's not really there in the cards for him. He probably will never get the chance. But he apparently put tons of Dark Tower references in this movie. Like it's just apparently covered in it.
Okay. I haven't read Dark Tower, so maybe I just missed them, but I was catching Stephen King references. I just didn't get into all the ones I caught. I will say that much.
Yeah, there was a lot for sure. And then there's one other thing that I was reading. Somebody mentioned the True Knot instill fear in their victims before they feed on the shine or the steam, and they feel it purifies it. And somebody mentioned that in it, Pennywise believes that frightened flesh tastes better than having been instilled with fear, it makes it taste better. So there's maybe a connection to be made there. The eyes that they have, the glowing eyes, there's a lot of glowing things in Stephen King's universe. Is there like deadlight connections or anything like that? Who knows? I don't know. I like that. The Stephen King universe is strong out there. So
SKEU.
We'll see more. But I had a lot of fun with this project and just overall enjoyed revisiting the world of The Shining. Reading the book was fun to get that kind of backstory as well. And yeah, I enjoyed this movie. I don't think that many people thought that this was going to outshine the Shining anyway, though. So we hope you enjoyed that.
Yeah, and if you wanted to hear about our next project, make sure to stick around to the very end, and we're gonna announce our next book that we're gonna be reading. But before all of that, we wanted to thank a new patron, Ashley W. Thank you so much for signing up. She is now going to get access to all of our bonus content. We have a new bonus episode coming out every month, and she already has access to the advanced reading prompts we do that let you know what we're doing next before anyone else. So if you wanted to join that and get all that extra stuff, go to patreon.com/ink2film and find out all about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being a patron. Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at ink2film. And make sure to join our Council of Inklings because we post polls and interesting adaptation news. You know, whatever we see that relates to the podcast, we try to talk about in there. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, and we wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music, and Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
Also, if you wanted to help out the podcast in a way that doesn't require any money, you could leave us a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Those really do help to get the word out about the podcast and continue to help us grow. Yeah, Apple Podcasts now, I believe it's called. But I think we have said iTunes like almost exclusively, so that's going to be a tough change for us. But yeah, wherever you can leave a rating and review is a huge help, so please consider doing it. All right, man. So I think we're at the very end here. So all we got left to do is announce our next project, which we have talked about in our bonus episodes and stuff, but I don't know if we put it out on the episode proper. So we are going to be covering Leviathan Wakes, which is the basis for the TV show The Expanse.
Right, and especially I think the first season, I believe that they line up pretty well. So, the first thing we're going to do is read roughly a third of the book and talk about the book, and then we're going to watch the first, I believe, 2 episodes of The Expanse, the show, talk about that, and then move through, much like we did for Game of Thrones, the rest of the season. So it'll end up being a 4-episode deep dive into the first season of The Expanse, leading up to, I believe, the release of the new season, which is coming soon. So if you're a fan of that show, we hope that you really check out those episodes. And we would love to see you for those ones.
Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, this is a project that I've been waiting to watch because we were going to cover it for the podcast. So I'm happy it's finally here.
Absolutely, man. All right. This is a long one, but we thank you for sticking with us. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.